Good afternoon. I've got whiskey in hand, and it is perfect. Yes, that's right. We're going to be talking today all about a concept that is attributed to Bill Hartman, and that is the ISA or infrasternal angle. We're going to be answering the question by the end of this episode of Beyond the Barbell, what I'm calling the podcast now, whether this ISA concept is understated or overrated. Okay. And along the way, we're going to do a number of things. We're going to talk first about just basic definitions. We're going to talk about why this idea of the ISA being attributed to Bill might not be completely accurate. We'll give you a brief, maybe not so brief history lesson about where the ISA comes from, what's been talked about, what the current literature is. We're going to talk about how you can find more information about this. And then we're going to answer your questions. And we're going to weave this into our understanding of how this kind of evolved historically, what the assessments are that we might do, and what some of the common presentations we might see are. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right in. Again, just starting with the basics. So when we're talking about the ISA, we're talking about the infrasternal angle. So the angle below the sternum. It's kind of cool how words work, right? So it's where the ribs meet like this. And you're going to hear this called a few different things if you're looking through the literature. And the reason it's important to know this is because if you Google, in Google Scholar, PubMed, infrasternal angle, you're not going to see a whole lot come up. The reason for that is this is often called a few different things. The main ones are going to be the costal arch or the subcostal margin. Okay, so if you're looking for more information on the infrasternal angle in general, try those search terms as well. Now, with that being said, I think, and this is going to be me pontificating for a little bit and just sharing my overall view of learning. So bear with me for a second. I think that before you dive into Bill's interpretation or my interpretation or anyone modern, you need to go back through the history and understand where this stuff comes from. And this is no different than learning anything else, right? I grew up playing jazz, right? And jazz is like old now, right? But I grew up listening to people who played in the 60s and 70s. But in order for me to know who Miles Davis is, who you've probably heard of, like Billy Madison, if peeing your pants is cool, consider me Miles Davis.
If peeing your pants is cool, consider me Miles Davis.
But if you know Miles Davis, you got to know about Charlie Parker. That's an older guy. If you know about Charlie Parker, you got to know about Benny Goodman. That's an older guy. If you got to know about Benny Goodman, you got to know about, see what I'm saying? So you got to know about the lineage here. And so I want to bring you through the history of the literature that talks about the infrasternal angle so that you can see what is the same between all of these. So what has kind of been the agreement? What is Bill saying or what am I saying that's no different than what's been said? And what is maybe something that's a newer interpretation? And then we can look at that and say, is this newer interpretation warranted or isn't it? Okay. Now, we're also going to talk about the current literature here. And what I'll say is there's very limited current literature on this. There's no systematic reviews available. It's mainly kind of mechanistic things or reliability of testing the ISA or assessing it with radiographs, so static images. And of course, we're talking about the dynamic behavior of the ISA when we're talking about Bill's interpretation and the physical therapy rehab performance context. So we will briefly just kind of summarize what's going on there before we dive into the history. Okay, and once again, by the end of this, we're going to answer, is the ISA concept, the way it's described today, overstated or underrated? Okay, so a few studies, mainly looking at, again, whether you can assess this on radiograph. That's static, not really that useful to us. And then few looking at ISA shape and asymmetry of the rib cage. I thought this was interesting enough to include, which is that one particular study saw that the ISA and its behavior correlated with an overall shift that we see from right to left. You're going to see this kind of in that left AIC, right BC pattern type description. Usually we do see a left lateral translation here. And the idea is that the infrasternal angle is also going to kind of move out and be affected by that. Okay, so I will link that down below so that you can read that as well. So now that we kind of get all that out of the way, let's go way back to 1918, and we're going to talk about the first description that I could find of the infrasternal angle. I'm sure there's earlier ones, but this was from Gray's Anatomy. And in Gray's Anatomy, they were talking mainly about ribcage shape. So I'm going to read you a little bit of what they said. quote, "The thorax of different individuals varies in shape. It may be flat, cylindrical, or conical. A narrow thoracic cage is longer than a wide one. Its infrasternal angle is more acute, and the intercostal spaces are wider." So that's kind of interesting. Goes on to say, "The thorax of males tends to be longer, wider, and more conical than that of females. Furthermore, the shape of the thorax depends on the individual's age." I'm not going to do anything with that information, but kind of interesting. Okay. Now we're going to move on a little later in time. This one's in the 1970s, and then I'm going to backtrack a little bit to before that. But anyways, here we go. This one is from a book called Surface and Radiological Anatomy for Students and General Practitioners by W.G. Hamilton. And in this, they talk again about a difference in shape in the slender versus broad trunk. Okay, so we're starting to see ribcage shape, kind of overall shape of the body. Consistent themes here across different sources. So let's read this. First, starting out with the broad trunk, which you may think of as the wide. This type may be associated with relatively long or short lower limbs. The lumbar region tends to be short. The ribs are situated more horizontally than in the slender subject. Okay, narrow versus wide. The infrasternal, subcostal angle is wider, and the sternum lies at a higher point. Okay, that's kind of interesting, right? When we think of this, wide with the sternum resting at a higher point, that's someone who's biasing what? Extension. Okay, so wide, biasing extension, so far, so good. On the other hand, the slender trunk, the book goes on to say, this type of subject tends to have a long lumbar region. Okay, so long lumbar. To me, long lumbar would mean more towards flexion, right? If I want to shorten the lumbar area, I bring it towards extension. So once again, if we think a narrow ISA is someone that biases a little bit more flexion and a little bit more counternutation in the sacrum, can we say? A little bit more external rotation overall. I think it's all tracking so far, okay? So Bill, so far so good, okay? This goes on to say, this text, that the ribs are obliquely placed, okay, obliquely placed. The infrasternal angle is small, and the sternum lies at a low level. So there's something to be said for maybe these narrow individuals do bias a little bit more flexion, right? Now, an interesting thing that was said right after this in this particular section that I wanted to include, this type is frequently described as hyposthenic or asthenic with reference to the frequency with which a relative weakness or deficiency of tone occurs in the muscular system. And so when we think about Bill's description of the wide versus narrow ISA, he kind of says the wide ISA might be someone who's better at producing high levels of force, and the narrow ISA might not be so good at producing high levels of force, but might be better at, let's say, turning or doing like quicker, lower pressure things versus higher pressure, high force activities as the wide would be better at. Now, in the same reference, we go on to look at male versus female. This is something I think we've heard Bill said before as well. The thorax in females is shorter and more rounded than in the male. And the upper ribs are more movable. Kind of interesting. Okay, so we've got some sex differences. We've got narrow versus wide. So we've already kind of talked about ribcage shape in these two references. And now we get to what I consider to be the all-time greats of physical therapy. And that is going to be Kendall and Sarman. So we'll start with Kendall. We'll take a little drink here. We got a sip in Kendall. If you haven't read Muscle Testing, Posture, and Pain by Kendall, you're missing out. I mean, that's to me, the source of this all. That's where Sarman comes from. PRI comes from Sarman. Bill, obviously heavily influenced by Sarman and PRI, if not directly, certainly indirectly. So let's see what Kendall has to say about the infrasternal angle. The first section I was able to find that talked about the infrasternal angle was talking about the transverse abdominis. So we've all heard about the transverse abdominis. It's like the magic muscle when we're talking about rehab in the trunk area, right? Everyone wants to know, can we isolate it? And we know that we can't really do that so much unless we're like highly trained dancers or something, right? So most of us can't do it. But the cool thing about the transverse abdominis is it compresses the viscera, right? And so here we have a little bit of commentary on that. Quote, the action acts like a girdle to flatten the abdominal wall and compress the abdominal viscera. The upper portion helps to decrease the infrasternal angle of the ribs as in expiration, okay? So this is all tracking so far. If we've got an infrasternal angle that's going to be more narrow, we want to bias exhalation, okay? Bill says, we've got a narrow angle, that's going to bias exhalation. So far, so good. Now, we're going to look at this other section that talks about what happens to the infrasternal angle when we do something like a sit-up. And I think this is really interesting. I'm going to tie in a question I got from Instagram here and answer that a little bit as well. So let's read the section first, and then we'll go into what this means for that question. And then we'll kind of tiptoe into assessments via Shirley, Bill, me. This will be fun. Okay. So, all right, the trunk flexion as in a sit-up. Okay. So we've got a couple of muscles to consider here. We got rectus abdominis, internal obliques, and external obliques. So let me just start with the question. The question was, if I've got a narrow ISA at the ISA itself, but then a couple of notches lower, it substantially widens, still narrow? Or maybe wide? Or maybe, as my buddy Kyle Waugh says, maybe it's a narrow that's identifying as a wide. All right, let's get into it first, starting with the early phase. Okay, so we're on the back, we're gonna do trunk flexion here, like a sit-up, okay? And this is what Kendall has to say about this. Along with depression of the chest, the ribs flare outward, and the infrasternal angle is increased. These movements are compatible with the action of the internal oblique, okay? So let's watch what happens. If I compress this down like this, you see how I get wide out there? But if my angle was, let's say, more narrow, especially structurally to begin with, then I kind of compress this down, I could get this look of wideness down low while still having an actual narrow angle up top, right? So there is some nuance to testing there. But yeah, if you look at someone, they kind of talk like a narrow, they walk like a narrow, they smell like a narrow, and trust me, narrows are smelly. I am one, so chill. They're probably narrow. Anyways, okay. Now we're done with the early phase of trunk flexion, okay? So we flex the trunk, we had a little bit of flaring of the ribs, infrasternal angle is starting to increase in this case, right? Okay, now as we go into the late phase, this is what Kendall has to say. As the trunk curl is completed and the movement enters the hip flexion phase, one will observe that the rib cage, which had flared outward, is now being pulled inward, that the infrasternal angle decreases. The anterior fibers of the external oblique now come into play. Okay, so what have we got from Kendall? We're flaring out, we probably got more internal oblique. We're coming in, we probably got more external oblique, okay? We had another muscle there we were going to talk about, which is the rectus abdominis. We pull the rectus abdominis down, that also kind of flares things out here. So rectus abdominis without external oblique, now we've got an angle here coming down and we got width below it, right? So to answer your question, you're probably still a narrow. I think I know who you are, so you're probably still a narrow. Okay, now we've talked about a couple of things. We've talked about the structure of the rib cage. We've talked about little male versus female, little broad versus slender. We've talked about internal versus external oblique. Now we're going to start to tie it together with what Shirley's got to say about this, Shirley Sarman. And we're going to start to get into assessments. We're going to talk about Bill's assessment. We're going to talk about what I think about these two assessment processes, what I like about them and what I prefer to do. And then we'll get into exercise selection, answer the rest of the questions, and we'll wrap this thing up before I'm too drunk. Okay, here we go. So I think one little fun comment here. Shirley Sarman, to me, Diane Lee, Kendall, these are the greats. These are the giants of PT, in my opinion. Okay, so if you haven't read them, you got to read them, period, right? And if you're in my program, they're going to be in the references section a whole lot, okay? With that said, when I look at those texts, so the Thorax by Diane Lee, movement system impairments, right? Or diagnosis and treatment of movement impairment syndromes, however the title is. Or Shirley's other book, which is movement impairments of the cervical and thoracic spines and extremities. I like to look through at some of these things and I go, how much volume is in there? Right? Is there a lot on the infrasternal angle or just a little bit? And so across Shirley's 2 books, which I think are like, absolutely crucial texts, there's 2 to 3 pages. And so in Diane Lee's text, there's literally 0 mention of the infrasternal angle. So when we look across those texts, and there's not much mention of it. Now, Diane Lee, to be fair, does mention it in her pelvic girdle book. But when there's that little volume of text around this stuff, the question is it really that this is just some cutting edge shit that we need to really be looking at, that like it's been overlooked? Or is it like the really smart people were like, yeah, that's just one data point. And that's one little thing we got to know. And if we can wrap that in with the rest of our assessment, take a big picture look and then make decisions from there, that's probably the best. Okay. And we'll dive into that in a second. Okay. Now in Shirley's book, she talks about the ISA assessment as being an assessment of abdominal muscle length primarily. Okay. So her assessment is as follows. You're going to go into bilateral flexion of the arm. So bring the arms overhead. And then in that position, you inhale to see if the rib cage expands, right? Because we would expect that as we bring the arms overhead into flexion, we should get opening of the infrasternal angle, okay? She goes on to say that an ISA of less than 70 degrees, so this is about 60, that's about 70, less than 70 degrees with the arms overhead and inhalation is a short and stiff external oblique, okay? She goes on to talk about some other stuff we've already talked about thus far, which is that males tend to have a narrower anterior to posterior dimension of the rib cage and a wider medial to lateral dimension. Okay. Now we're talking about anterior posterior compression, a lot of Bill Hartman stuff in there, right? A lot of shape differences there. Whereas females tend to have a rounder chest wall with a narrower overall diameter. So again, thinking about somebody who has maybe like a more cylindrical axial skeleton that is biasing compression overall and creating that more narrow diameter, right? So the shape being more expansive, but the muscle activity being more compressive. And I think this is where Bill's idea of like a primary level of compression, right? You have a shape that's like a little bit more expanded. So you have a strategy that's a little more compressed. You have a shape that's a little bit more compressed, front to back especially. And then so you're trying to inhale kind of against that, but then again, that just furthers that shape. Now, last but not least, in Shirley's text, she talks about central obesity, right? So if you're fat in your stomach, especially if you're a guy, that's just going to increase the width. So if you're trying to like close your angle and you're a real fat person, probably just focus on weight loss. All right, moving on. So now let's talk about Bill's model. Let me preface this whole section. Here's a little sip for Bill. I 100% respect Bill. I think he's a brilliant guy. I love his model. Really influenced me a lot. I think that within this discussion, he probably agreed with me on a lot of things. I think the way he probably uses his model in reality is very different from how people receive what he's saying about his model. So nothing that I'm about to say should be received as being critical to him at all. I think without him, there's a lot of things that come from Sarman and Kendall that we wouldn't be exposed to. And you could say the same thing about other people, but love Bill, okay? So no hate on Bill. The other thing I should say here is that I'm not a student of Bill's, okay? I watched a bunch of YouTube videos just like everything else, and I can understand where things come from because I understand the history, again, because that's how I learned everything. And I think that's the best way to learn. But I'm not going to comment in any sort of depth about Bill's takes here. I'm just going to talk a little bit about sort of what the things are that most people have seen and what I kind of think of it, okay? So Bill, kind of as we've talked about in all these other texts, describes the wide and the narrow archetypes. So he kind of extends this to not just what's going on at the ISA, but what can we expect to see from like a spine bias in terms of movement? What can we see from a sacrum and lumbar spine, as well as pelvic shape in terms of the bias? And I think a lot of that stuff is cool, right? I think a lot of it tracks too, to be honest, right? But really, there's the narrow and the wide, and there's different conversations now about what is the diaphragm doing, what are the pressure gradients, is there a low pressure strategy in the narrow, a high in the wide? Again, I don't think these things are that much different from the history that we've talked about thus far, but I think it's an extension of the conversation that's beneficial. Okay. Now I'll leave you to go check out Bill's stuff, go buy his program, go learn from him directly. I'm not going to speak for him here. Okay. I just don't think it's going to be all that instructive. But before I kind of weigh in, let me talk a little bit about assessments here. In Bill's assessment, as far as I know, again, could be different now, he has someone take their arms, come up overhead, and lean them back. And he leans them back until, or just before, their rib cage starts to orient back as a unit, right? Because if we orient the rib cage backwards, right, the angle is going to tend to open. So what he's trying to do is he's trying to create a position in which he is not biasing someone towards narrow and not biasing someone towards wide. Instead, he's kind of allowing it to be in the middle to get sort of the truest read on what the actual dynamics are at the rib cage. And he's going to put the hand on the angle itself, going to follow the ribs as they're moving in and out to try to assess, is this someone that has dynamics in both directions or they're lacking in one versus the other, right? The wide should be able to open easier than close. The narrow should be able to close easier than open. Or is it someone that lacks in both directions? My view on this is when we look at his assessment versus Shirley's, Shirley's coming up all the way to the extreme where you would expect that this would open. And if it doesn't open, she goes, that's shortness, right? And I kind of agree with this approach on this, right? Because in terms of looking for what's a problem versus what's not a problem, if I see someone that should be able to do something in a certain context and I've made it really easy for them to be able to do that, but they still can't, then that's something that I'm flagging in my brain as like maybe something to look at. We'll talk about why in a little bit. Maybe this isn't even the case, but how I will do the assessment, if I do it, is a combination of what you've heard about Bill, what you've heard about Shirley, and then I'll go one step further, right? So Shirley goes to an extreme, and then she sees, I expect you to be able to open. Can you open? Bill goes in the middle, doesn't bias it one way or the other, and then sees what the dynamics are. I go, okay, those two are good. The third one that's good is bring someone into more of like a slumped or a downward reaching position where it should be easy to close the angle. And can they, right? If they can't close the angle with a downward reach, then I'm like, okay, I'm flagging that. They should be able to, and they can't. That's probably a serious reduction in dynamics. That might be something I want to address. Again, might be. We'll talk about why might in a little bit. So hopefully that clears it up. Now, let me talk a little bit about applications from here on out. And we have to discuss models in general to actually be able to have a meaningful conversation about this. So there's many different subtypes of models. And I'm not like the model expert or anything like that. There's descriptive models, conceptual models, predictive models, prescriptive models, explanatory models. I don't know what they all mean, but ChatGPT does. So I asked ChatGPT about what these models meant, and this is what ChatGPT told me. A predictive model is one that's focused on forecasting the future, and specifically future outcomes based on current data. I'm going to go through a couple of these, and I'll tell you, how I think people use it incorrectly. An explanatory model is one that's designed to explain relationships between variables, identifying cause and effect mechanisms. Then we have prescriptive, which is recommending specific actions to achieve desired outcomes, often used in decision making. Okay? And then there's descriptive, which is aiming to summarize or describe data without attributing a cause or making predictions. Now, I think that these first three, so predictive, explanatory, and prescriptive, are the ways that people want to be able to use the ISA. They want to be able to say that based on the ISA, I think this is going to happen, this is going to be good, and this is not going to be good. I think that they like to say, well, the reason that this is happening is because you're a narrow ISA and you have a downward pressure gradient, right? And they want to be able to say, based on the fact that you're a narrow ISA, you can't do an RDL because you can't achieve this shape change at the pelvis. You can't nutate the sacrum. You can't IR the iliums. I don't buy any of this. I really don't. We'll talk in more detail in a second about why. How I best believe this model is used is to simply describe what we're seeing. And I think that mainly this is useful from a retrospective perspective. A retrospective perspective. Cheers to that. So just to review again, A descriptive model is one that summarizes or describes data without establishing causation or making predictions. I think that we can notice patterns and connections between things without necessarily trying to say, hey, this is gonna happen, or this is the reason this is happening. I think that it's fine to leave that uncertainty there. And I think in many cases, it's better because it allows us to actually be open to surprises and over time just realize the weight of sort of like the weight of each variable, right? And I think that the weight of the ISA as a variable is actually way lower than people who are checking this stuff out think, okay? So now to some other questions. This one around exercise selection. Does wide versus narrow ISA really matter in exercise selection? And I would say that it can, but it is so far down on the list of what matters for exercise selection that for me, it's not even on the radar, really, right? I think the ISA model does a great job at explaining why we might see people self-select into certain stances, grips, widths, angles, variations, etc. over time, even activities, right? Like, I think it probably correlates with that. But for me, if I'm looking at someone and their demands for what they need for their program, I'm starting with A, what is going to help me get the adaptation in the trainable qualities I need to help them meet those goals, and B, what do they enjoy? If I can satisfy those two things, mostly everything else is going to take care of itself. And 9 times out of 10, they're going to end up self-selecting into all those variables that I just mentioned in accordance with their ISA anyways. And then after the fact, I can go, oh, wasn't that cool how like they're probably like a narrow ISA and they selected into like these narrower stances and maybe like an E-yard orientation of some of these limbs within that narrow stance and maybe more squatty stuff versus hingy stuff. But I don't need to make all those assumptions up front and then limit people from being able to achieve the opposite side of the variability spectrum. And this brings us to another question, which is, quote, I heard Bill say that hinging exercises like RDLs are a bad idea for a narrow ISA. Do you agree? I totally disagree. I think this is complete bullshit. I think that, yeah, maybe the narrow ISA ends up being better at squatting up and down. I think that maybe they do have trouble achieving a shape change in the axial skeleton towards extension. So work on it, right? If we have variability between extension and flexion, and someone's better at flexion, well, yeah, maybe if things are sensitive, we're in a rehab context, then it makes more sense to say, hey, let's roll with the positions that are already comfortable for you, find a way to load you up and progress you within those. Great. But eventually, especially from a performance perspective, we need to be able to represent the opposite end of the variability spectrum. Someone's good at flexion, they got to learn to extend, you know? And a lot of times I find that training is just about filling in gaps. So if someone's narrow and they're already real good at doing all this kind of shit, maybe you want them to do some of that shit too, right? I don't look at things from this like compensatory good, bad movement perspective. I think it's totally unhelpful. I think it creates more barriers than it does help. I think it does more harm than good. And so overall, the answer to that question is no, RDLs are not only not a bad idea for a narrow ISA, they're a fucking great idea. All right. Now, again, kind of transitioning into a question based on what I just said is, do you refrain from telling patients their ISA, don't want to pathologize structure, or is it just good education? It's totally irrelevant to most people. Definitely doesn't need to be communicated whatsoever. There's no reason for that. They don't care. You shouldn't care that much either. And again, if we're telling them like, you have this, we're just giving them another label. We're giving them another diagnosis. Like, I think it can be communicated in a way that's not harmful, but I just think it's fucking irrelevant for most people, you know? So you just recognize what they are, you proceed accordingly. If it helps you make better decisions, as Bill says, then go ahead and do it, okay? And so this brings us to one last final question, and basically the whole point of this podcast, which is the ISA understated or overrated? And I would say that with everything we've just said, I'm saying based on where the ISA is in terms of our discussion, our focus, the amount of engagement it gets online versus the amount of actual difference it makes in practice, I'm going overrated. And I would say that the ISA, it's one data point. And it's also one way to assess the dynamic function of the rib cage. There's so many more approaches out there. We can put our hands on the side of the rib cage and look at lateral expansion. We can look at one side moving to the other. We can do AP expansion. We can look at the dynamic function of the rib cage without having to put our hands on a rib cage, right? There's so many ways to look at this. So again, I think this is just one data point. If you understand the theory and the applications of it from the perspective of someone like Bill, I don't think that's going to do you any harm, but I think you just need to understand that just because you learn a system doesn't mean you become a system. So with that said, here's some whiskey. Hopefully that was helpful with understanding the ISA. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. Like, subscribe, all that good shit. I'm going to have a blog on this coming up, so be on the lookout for there. New website up, chapmanperformance.com. As always, thanks for watching, and until next time, peace.